Maggie Stinson sat in her small, windowless office, staring at the outdated computer screen as if her entire life had led up to this moment. She had known something was coming. The air had felt different at the company for months, heavy, charged, like the stillness before a storm. The once familiar buzz of phones, the laughter in the breakroom, even the steady thrum of work, had taken on a more sinister tone. The email had come that morning, short, cold, unsigned. Meeting at 9 a.m., sharp in the CEO's office. She had dreaded the walk down the long corridor, feeling the eyes of her colleagues following her like shadows. As the executive assistant of the paving company for over a decade, Maggie knew the rhythms of this place, the faces, the quirks, and more importantly, the secrets. But nothing had prepared her for what waited behind that polished wooden door. Tony Whitman, the CEO, had been sitting behind the desk that once belonged to his father. He was casually leaning back in the plush chair, eyes sharp, his lips curled in a smirk she had grown to despise. Next to him stood his daughter, Vanessa, a statuesque brunette barely out of college, dressed in a crisp white blouse that reeked of entitlement. Vanessa didn't speak, but her presence said everything. "Maggie," Tony began, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "As of today, I'm going to have to let you go." She blinked, the words not quite registering. "What?" "My daughter Vanessa is starting here today. We need to make room for fresh ideas, new energy. I'm sure you understand, you've been a valuable asset, but your time here is up. Today will be your last day." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth, ready to plead her case, to remind him of her loyalty, her decade of service. But nothing came out. The coldness in Tony's eyes told her there would be no negotiation. There was no room for her here anymore, no matter how hard she'd worked, no matter how many nights she'd stayed late, making sure his father's company ran smoothly. She stumbled out of the office, Tony's voice still ringing in her ears. "You can leave immediately. We'll have security escort you out." The door shut behind her with a snap. Her whole world, the stability she had clung to for 10 years, collapsed in that moment. The company, once a family-run operation with a heart, had changed. The rot had started when Tony returned, after years of exile following his youthful recklessness. The charming rogue, the black sheep, who had been disowned for his wild schemes, illegal dealings, and involvement in a multi-level marketing scandal, had wormed his way back into his father's good graces. Tony had promised change, begged for redemption. The chairman had relented, handing over the reins of the company when his health began to fail. But Tony had never changed, and everyone, especially Maggie, had watched in horror as he dragged the company down into the mud with him. Maggie wandered through the parking lot in a daze. The world outside hadn't changed, the sun still shone, and cars still hummed along the busy road. But inside, Maggie's life had shifted dramatically. She felt hollow, cast aside like an old relic. A bitter taste filled her mouth as she thought of Tony's smug face. The memory of his father, Edward Whitman, lingered in her mind. How he had built this company from the ground up, how he had once treated his employees like family. She couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. Maggie had stood by the Whitmans, had supported them through every twist and turn, even when Tony had returned like a prodigal son, dragging the weight of his tarnished reputation behind him. Edward's decision to bring Tony back had been met with resistance, particularly from Andrea, the site manager, and Edward's trusted Ollie. Andrea had fought hard for the company, working alongside Maggie to keep things running smoothly despite Tony's disruptive presence. She had been vocal about her concerns from the beginning, warning Edward that Tony wasn't ready to lead. But Edward's heart had softened, blinded by fatherly love and the illness that was slowly eating away at him. Maggie could still hear Andrea's voice from that day in the boardroom. "He's reckless, Edward. He'll destroy everything you've built." Edward had brushed her off. "Give him a chance, Andrea. He's my son." And so they had given him a chance that had led to disaster. Tony's leadership had been chaotic from the start. He had misused company funds, treated employees with disdain, and made decisions that were more about self-indulgence than the good of the company. The once thriving atmosphere had turned toxic and people started leaving, unable to stomach Tony's arrogance and disrespect. Maggie's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Andrea. Maggie hesitated for a moment before answering. "Are you all right?" Andrea's voice was low, filled with concern. I don't even know where to start," Maggie replied, her voice shaking. "Tony fired me. His daughter's taking my place." There was a long pause on the other end. "I knew this was coming," Andrea finally said. "He's been trying to push anyone loyal to his father out. He needs to surround himself with people who won't question him." "I confronted him about the expenses," Maggie said, the frustration rising in her voice. "He's been using company money for personal things, Andrea. I couldn't just stand by anymore. I know, he's been doing the same thing to the crew, threatening them, making them cut corners to save money. It's not just about the paving business anymore, it's about control. Maggie felt a surge of anger. We can't let him get away with this. We won't, Andrea replied, her voice steely. We need to talk. Meet me at the diner tonight. There's something I need to tell you. Maggie agreed, hanging up and feeling a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. Andrea was still in her corner, and maybe, just maybe, they could do something to stop Tony before it was too late. The diner was nearly empty when Maggie arrived that evening. She spotted Andrea sitting in a booth at the back, her face serious, her fingers drumming impatiently on the table. Andrea was a strong woman, tough, unyielding, the backbone of the company in many ways. She had been with Edward from the early days, building the company from a small operation to the regional success it had become. Now, she looked like someone who had seen too much, carried too many burdens. Maggie slid into the seat across from her. What's going on? Andrea didn't waste time. Tony isn't the real president. Maggie blinked, taken aback. What do you mean? He's been using the title, sure, but legally he's not in charge. Edward never finalized the paperwork to make Tony the president. Officially, Edward's still the representative director. Tony has been acting like he's in control, but he has no legal authority. Maggie stared at her, processing the information. So what does that mean for the company? Andrea leaned in closer. It means we still have a chance to stop him. Edward's been too ill to deal with the day-to-day, but he didn't give Tony full control. If we act now, we can expose what Tony's been doing before he causes even more damage. Maggie felt a rush of adrenaline. But how do we prove it? How do we take him down? Andrea smiled grimly. We've already started. I've been gathering evidence, misappropriation of funds, falsified reports, even some of the threats he's made to the workers. But we need to move fast. If Edward's condition worsens, Tony will push to finalize the transition and get full control. Maggie felt a spark of hope. I'm in. Whatever you need, I'll help. Andrea nodded. Good. We're going to need all the help we can get. Tony's not going to go down without a fight. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of secret meetings, late-night phone calls, and hushed conversations in dark corners of the office. Maggie and Andrea worked tirelessly, collecting documents, gathering testimony from employees who had witnessed Tony's misdeeds. Each piece of evidence they found only deepened the mystery of how far Tony's corruption had spread. As they dug deeper, they discovered that Tony had been siphoning off company funds for months, using shell companies and fake invoices to cover his tracks. But it wasn't just the money. He had been sabotaging deals, cutting corners on projects, all to maintain his lifestyle of gambling, extravagant parties, and expensive gifts for his wife. The breaking point came when Maggie found a document buried deep in the company's archives, one that proved Tony had been planning to sell the company's assets to a competitor, pocketing millions in the process. Maggie immediately took it to Andrea. This is it, she said breathlessly. This is how we end him. Andrea's eyes lit up with determination. We need to get this to Edward. But when they arrived at Edward's estate later that day, they were greeted by a grim-faced butler. Mr. Whitman isn't taking any visitors, he said quietly. Maggie's heart sank. Edward's condition had worsened, and it was clear he didn't have much time left. But they couldn't wait any longer. If Tony finalized the takeover, there would be nothing left to save. They were running out of time. The moment Maggie had been dreading came the next day. Tony, standing in front of the entire board of directors, his voice dripping with confidence, declared himself the rightful president of the company. He spoke of progress, of innovation, of a new era for the business. Maggie stood in the back of the room, her hands clenched into fists. She could see the smirks on the faces of Tony's cronies, the people he had brought in to replace the loyal employees who had served Edward faithfully. But then, as Tony finished his speech, Andrea stood up. That's enough, Tony, she said, her voice ringing out across the room. Tony's face darkened. What are you doing, Andrea? Andrea held up the document Maggie had found. I think you've forgotten one important thing. You're not the president. Legally, you've never been. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward Andrea. Tony's smug expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. What the hell are you talking about? He spat, his voice losing its earlier bravado. Andrea held her ground. I'm talking about the fact that you've been operating under a lie. Edward never finalized the paperwork to transfer the presidency to you. Officially, you're still just a figurehead. Any decisions you've made, any orders you've given, they're all illegitimate. Gasps rippled through the room. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. the confidence in Tony's leadership visibly crumbling. Maggie watched as Tony's face flushed with anger, the mask of control slipping. "You're bluffing," Tony hissed, stepping toward Andrea, his fists clenched. "You don't have proof of anything." Andrea raised an eyebrow, unshaken. "Oh, I have more than proof." She turned toward the projection screen at the front of the room and motioned to Maggie, who stood by the controls. Maggie hesitated only for a second before pressing a button, and the screen lit up with scanned documents, Tony's fraudulent dealings, the shell companies, the falsified financial reports. Everything they had gathered over the last few weeks was laid bare for everyone to see. The room erupted into chaos. Board members shouted questions, voices overlapping as they struggled to make sense of what was happening. Tony's face had gone white, and for the first time, he seemed truly afraid. "You think this is going to stop me?" he barked, his voice rising with desperation. "You think anyone in this room cares about those documents? I'm the future of this company. Enough." A voice boomed from the back of the room. The room fell silent again as all eyes turned to the doorway. Edward Whitman, frail and hunched over, stood leaning on a cane. His presence alone seemed to command respect, and Maggie felt a wave of emotion seeing him there. Despite his illness, despite everything, Edward had come to face the mess his son had made. Tony looked stunned, frozen in place. "Dad, you shouldn't be here." Edward slowly made his way toward the front of the room, each step labored but deliberate. When he reached the center, he stopped and looked directly at his son. "You've done enough damage, Tony," Edward said quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I gave you a chance to prove yourself, to show that you had changed. But all you've done is destroy everything I built. You lied to me, to this company, and to yourself." Tony's face twisted in anger. "I did what had to be done. You were too weak to take this company into the future. I'm the only one who can." "No," Edward interrupted, his voice sharp. "You're not, and you never were." The weight of his words hung in the air, final and unforgiving. Maggie saw the anger drain from Tony's face, replaced by something else: panic. He looked around the room, but there was no one left to defend him. The board members, who had once supported him out of fear or self-interest, now sat in stunned silence, their loyalty evaporating. Edward turned to Andrea and Maggie. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was happening," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I should have listened to you both. I should have stopped this before it went so far." Andrea nodded, her eyes softening. "It's not too late, Edward. We can still make things right." Maggie felt a surge of relief. Edward's presence alone was enough to turn the tide. The room seemed to shift, the power Tony had wielded evaporating in the face of his father's quiet authority. But Tony wasn't finished. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me?" Tony growled, his voice shaking with rage. "You think this is over? I'm not going down like this." He lunged for the documents on the table, his desperation boiling over. But before he could reach them, 2 security guards moved in, grabbing him by the arms and pulling him back. Tony struggled, his face contorted with fury, but it was useless. The guards held him firm as he thrashed against them. "You'll regret this," Tony screamed, his voice echoing through the room. "I'll make you all pay for this. Every single one of you." But no one paid him any attention. The guards dragged him from the room, his shouts growing fainter as the door slammed shut behind him. The room remained silent for a moment longer before Edward turned back to the board. Effective immediately, "Tony is no longer associated with this company," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I will take responsibility for everything that has happened. And I will ensure that the people who truly care about this business are the ones who lead it into the future." Maggie and Andrea exchanged a look, a shared sense of victory and relief washing over them. They had done it. They had stopped Tony before he could ruin everything. But as Maggie stood there, watching Edward take control once again, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. Though Tony was gone, the damage he had done could not be undone so easily. Over the next few weeks, the reality of the situation became clear. The company was bleeding money. Tony's mismanagement had left the business in a fragile state. And even with Edward and Andrea's efforts to stabilize things, it became apparent that the damage might be too deep to repair. The employees, those who had stayed loyal, who had weathered the storm, watched anxiously as the financial reports rolled in, each more dire than the last. When doors began pulling out, longtime clients hesitated to renew contracts, and the company's reputation, once sterling, had been tarnished beyond recognition. Edward, weakened by his illness, could only do so much. He called for an emergency meeting with the board, and it was there that the final blow was delivered. "We don't have a choice," Edward said, his voice thick with regret. "The company is too far gone. I'm afraid we have to close our doors." The announcement hit like a tidal wave. Maggie sat in the back of the room, her heart sinking. She had hoped, despite everything, that they could salvage what was left. But the truth was undeniable. Tony's greed had not only destroyed his own future, but the future of hundreds of employees who had built their lives around the company. After the meeting, Maggie stood outside in the cool evening air, watching as employees filed out, their faces marked with disbelief, anger, and sadness. She had given 10 years of her life to this place, and now it was all gone. Andrea joined her, her expression grim but determined. "It's not over yet." Maggie looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "We're not going to let Tony's actions be the end of us. Edward and I have been talking. We're starting a new company, something small, but built on the values we used to have. Integrity, respect, family. And we want you to be part of it." Maggie felt a rush of gratitude, a small spark of hope in the darkness. "Really?" Andrea nodded. "We need people like you, Maggie. People who care." Maggie smiled, the weight of the last few weeks lifting just a little. "I'm in." Meanwhile, Tony's life had fallen apart in the aftermath of his public disgrace. His wife, Camille, who had once basked in the luxury and power his position afforded her, found herself embroiled in the legal consequences of Tony's misdeeds. The couple was soon entangled in a series of lawsuits, facing charges for embezzlement and fraud. Camille, who had turned a blind eye to Tony's growing corruption for years, now realized the extent of his recklessness. She left him, filing for divorce and distancing herself from the wreckage he had created. Tony, once a man who believed he could manipulate anyone and anything, now found himself alone, shunned by his former friends and associates. He had lost everything: his family, his wealth, and his reputation. The legal system would soon take whatever remained. Months passed, and the dust settled. The old company was gone, but in its place, Andrea, Maggie, and a handful of former employees built something new. The new company, though small, thrived on the values that had been lost in Tony's era of greed. It was more than a business, it was a family again. Maggie stood in the office one evening, looking out at the small but bustling workspace. She smiled, feeling a sense of peace and purpose she hadn't felt in years. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, and in their place was something stronger, something true. She had fought for what was right, and in the end, that fight had been worth it. The shadows of betrayal had been cast aside, and what remained was hope. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, give it a thumbs up, hit the bell, and drop a comment. Your feedback is greatly appreciated.